So good morning, everyone. It's my great honor to be a part of this panel with distinguished panelists and audiences. And I would like to express my special thanks to Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies and Professor Jia for inviting me to this panel. My presentation today discusses my preliminary research on the U.S.-China relations and China's partake in global governance under the framework of the WTO, World Trade Organization. And I examined the extent to which China has liberalized its economy over the past 10 years in its interaction with the WTO, and specifically through case studies of China's WTO trade disputes in the automotive and wind turbine sectors. I demonstrate how China's industrial policy measures stay one step ahead of the WTO rule enforcement, and hence the title of my talk. So with China's entry into the WTO, many experts expected that China would further liberalize its economy, and China has so. And China lifted over 8,000 trade-related barriers. And the liberalization group of experts highlight the role of the WTO and multinational companies. So first, the WTO and its trade, the dispute settlement body, DSB. First, the WTO and DSB provides rule enforcing and rule providing mechanisms while providing a social environment for international norm adoption. And second, a lot of scholars argue that once countries join international legal agreements, they change their behaviors out of reputational concerns. And lastly, according to Linda Weiss and Robert Wade, they basically argue that the WTO rules are inherently more restrictive for developing countries than for developed countries by prohibiting various industrial policy measures that developing countries may wish to use. And another group of scholars highlight the role of multinational companies. Scholars such as Jeff Fried and Helen Milner basically argue that multinational companies are forced for liberalization by acting as a liberalizing expert lobbying group and calling for increasing market access in emerging economies. And empirically, China has been an increasingly important part of the WTO trade dispute settlement body. And from 2001 to 2012, China has been part of 137 trade disputes at the WTO, 11 as a complainant and 30 as a respondent on 19 different matters, and 96 as a third party. And China's compliance record in the WTO dispute settlements has been quite outstanding. In the 11 completed cases where China was a respondent, Beijing has either reached an agreement with the complainant over the contested measures, or it has removed the measures that the WTO found inconsistent with China's obligation with the WTO. And conventional wisdom views China's compliance with the WTO rulings as an example of China's socialization into the international norms and the effectiveness of the WTO in addressing trade concerns as compared to the bilateral trade negotiations. But if China's compliance with the WTO ruling is a token of China's socialization into the international norms, why do we not see the simultaneous decrease in China's adoption of WTO inconsistent industrial policy measures? So China's achievement in this regard is overshadowed by increasing criticism by foreign governments and foreign businesses over diminishing access to the Chinese market. So the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission and EU Chambers of Commerce in China have heavily criticized China for being a pay-to-play market and heavy reliance of the industrial policy measures to develop domestic companies, especially state-owned enterprises. And China's strategy not only pretends the comeback of state capitalism, but also creates increasing trade tensions with other countries over the issues of anti-dumping, subsidies, and discrimination against foreign businesses or imports. So this begs the question of how to reconcile these two different pictures of China's successful compliance with the WTO rulings and increasing adoption of WTO inconsistent industrial policy measures. What does this tell us about China's ability to flout the WTO rules, or what does this tell us about the inherent limitations of WTO's institutional design? Or what does this tell us about, in the literature, there are a lot of discussions about international institutions socializing China. So what does this tell us about who is socializing whom and who is limiting whom between China and the international organization? So basically, based on my preliminary research, I basically argue that China's compliance with the WTO rulings reflects Beijing's skillful navigation through the limitations of the WTO's institutional design, rather than its pure reflection of socialization into the international legal norms. And unlike what Robert Wade and Linda Weiss argues that the WTOs are constraining the operational room of developing countries, I basically argue that developing countries still have a room to maneuver and often implement industrial policies without worrying about its international consequences. And they removes them after these measures are in disputes at the WTO. So I use this term convenient compliance because China complies with the WTO rulings without much negative economic consequences. Two things, because by the time China complies with the WTO rulings, first, it has already achieved its developmental goals that it put those industrial measures in the first place. And second, it can still build up its reputation as a responsible WTO member by complying with the final ruling. So I'm not saying this is only applicable to Chinese case, but it can be applied to other emerging cases. I haven't done cross-national comparison yet, but these kind of convenient compliance are actually enabled by two things. First, I argue that WTO's institutional limitations create incentives for countries to engage in this practice of convenient compliance without worrying much about the negative consequences. So the formal dispute process at the WTO is a four-stage process consisting of, as you can see here, consultation, panel proceedings, and appellate review and implementation stage. And these four processes takes from 6 months to 6 years. Just like any other legal proceedings, it takes a long time. And besides this bureaucratic delays, dispute settlement body's main redress is to push the offending countries to revoke the measures instead of violating the countries for instead of punishing for that violation. So the measures is prospective rather than retrospective, meaning that it covers only losses commencing as of the date of the ruling instead of the date of violation. So in this context, it's countries' best interest to adopt industrial policy measures and remove them once they are in disputes at the WTO level. And during the dispute process, countries can buy time for domestic industry adjustment. Second is multinational companies' force for liberalization. I argue that not necessarily that's the case. Multinational companies often implicitly or explicitly support protectionist measures in China, either because they worry about retaliation from the Chinese government, or they still gain benefits by gaining access to the even smaller pieces of ever-enlarging pies of Chinese trade and Chinese market. And also, global supply chain certainly complicates the domestic payoffs of involved companies over the issue of initiating trade disputes with China. So as an effort to substantiate China's pattern of convenient compliance, I examined two recently completed trade cases, one in automotive industry and the other one in wind turbine industry. And I chose these two sectors because they received strategic support from the government, and both cases are viewed as positive examples of China complying with the WTO's final rulings. So I saw it as a more of an indicative examples. So I'll move really quickly. First is the auto case. And this is the first case that China followed the whole procedures of the WTO trade disputes from consultation up to the appeal. And it's the first case that China complied with the ruling after WTO ruled against China. So once called the heaven of bicycle, China actually became the largest auto market in the world in 2010, consisting a quarter of the world auto market. And then the Chinese government, in order to develop local suppliers, actually put a very stringent requirements on the joint venture, auto joint ventures, which is that at the end of the first year, the joint ventures have to meet 40% of the local content requirements, leading up to 80% by the end of the third year of operation. However, local content requirement is not allowed under the WTO membership, so China had to eliminate the local content requirements. So in order to counteract the impact of elimination of local content requirements, Chinese government adopted a new regulation. That was, if the final car has more than 60% of imported auto parts, it was charged 25% for fully imported cars tariff instead of 10% of auto parts. So if you're auto parts makers in Ontario or Ohio and Detroit, of course you're not happy. So pressured by the domestic auto parts makers in the United States and Canada and European Union, those countries' trade representatives actually brought the case to the WTO. After 4 years of negotiations, China finally removed the measures. However, according to this interview with the president of GM China, he basically said China's decision to comply with the WTO will virtually have no impact on our operation, which is GM's most successful operation, that is in Shanghai and throughout in China, is because all these joint ventures already localized their supply chain. So it basically showed that because of this long process of dispute settlements, actually the WTO rules in a way have only a marginal impact, even after the final rulings. And it also shows a diverging interest between expert lobbying groups in the United States and Canada and European Union and the multinational companies which are already localized in China. Second case, really briefly, this is about the China Special Fund for the wind turbine industries. And people might say, what color is China? Is China red? Is China gray, right? The air pollution. But a lot of people agree that China is going green. And China became the largest wind power in the world in 2010. And it actually became the global wind power in less than a decade. And as you can see, who are actually driving this China become the largest wind power in the world? Up until mid-2000s, the 70% of the market share was captured by the foreign companies such as GE, Vestas, Gamesa, and then Suzlon. But in 5 years later, it was captured all by the Chinese companies like Sinobel and so what happened over those 5 years of period? Chinese government adopted a lot of industrial policy measures to help these domestic companies, including local content rate, increased tariffs, and increased subsidies for the Chinese companies, and required joint venture partnership for those foreign companies that already had an operation in China. And not a single central government funded project actually were for the multinational companies since 2005. So the US brought the case to the WTO, and after a year, China removed the measures. And what happened? Chinese state-owned enterprises, they became they all went global market with backed by the Chinese state sponsorship. So measures adopted in 2003, case brought to the WTO in 2010, measures revoked in 2011. So it's a long period of time. So by the time that China removed the measures, it already achieved its goal, and that's why I argue that it's a convenient compliance. So as you can see, the rise of Chinese companies. So what are the implications? The final comment is that because of the failure of the Doha round, a lot of this international trade liberalization is preceded with litigation and the interpretation of these WTO rules. But when these WTO rulings are not making much difference in terms of pushing forward in this international trade liberalization, it's actually asking us important systemic questions for the WTO. And then the second is the rise of state capitalism. I mean, it used to be, industrial policy, state capitalism had a lot of negative connotations, but I noticed that whenever I go to political science conferences this year, there's a special panel called America's Industrial Policy. So in a way that it's not just international institutions that is socializing China, but China is also socializing other parts of the world as well. Thank you so much.